going to finish off this part of it, and then we're going to start a new lecture. But in the meantime, we're going to have a quiz based on the information that I'm going to finish off now and what we had last week. So eligibility for a remote pilot license. Well, that's a bummer. Thank you. Is there anything that can be done at 13 years old? What? You can register a drone at 13 years old. Issuance essentially means that when you have completed your courses and you've passed the test, and we have gotten on together on a site called IACRA, and we have applied to the federal government, to the FAA, for your permanent license, they will issue you a license only after they've had an opportunity to review your test score and to make sure that you are not an undesirable character, which could mean a lot of jail time or terrorist. Once they've gone through that process, they will issue you a temporary certificate, much as they do with all pilot licenses. We get a temporary certificate as a pilot, and sometimes it takes as many as 120 days for them to send you the permanent license. The license we talked about before, which is a hard copy plastic license. The same license I have. The difference is on the back side, yours will say remote pilot, mine says commercial pilot. But the same kind of privileges that you have, which is to be able to hold that license for life, as long as you don't do something that would cause either a suspension or revocation of the license. They will note for you that it's good for 120 days, and rarely have I seen any temporary certificate in use for 120 days. They're normally a good 3 months, maybe maximum, so 90 days, perhaps a little bit more than that. Often less than that. So don't panic if your permanent license doesn't get to you in, let's say, 90 days. If it was 90 days and over, I would probably call Oklahoma City and ask them for information about where your permanent license is. Now, once you have that and you start becoming the pilot in command for whatever financial services you want to hire, you want to charge people, every 2 years, like all the pilots that I know and flight instructors, we all have to submit to what is called a biennial flight review. We actually have to go up and demonstrate our capability to another instructor. I do too. Even though I'm an instructor, I still have to go up every 2 years with an instructor for 1 hour in the air and 1 hour ground school in order to be allowed to continue using my flight license. Same is true of you, but you don't have to demonstrate anything other than you have to take an online recurrency test, which I can tell you that by the time you become a licensed remote drone pilot, that recurrency test will not be a big deal. You'll probably fly through the answers in no time. You'll surprise yourself at how much you know by the end of 2 years when it comes time to take your first recurrency test. So don't worry about it. Be a good, smart, intellectual individual when it comes to doing the right things with your pilot license. And so by the time your recurrency comes along, it's not going to be a big deal. Knowledge tests. We all have to take knowledge tests. I had to take knowledge tests to become a pilot, a commercial pilot, an instrument rating, a multi-engine, and I had to take a knowledge test to become a flight instructor. So I've gone through a bunch of knowledge tests, much as you're going to have to go through it. Knowledge test means that at the end of this semester, the test you take is the knowledge test that requires a passing grade of at least 70. There are 60 questions on the exam. They're all multiple choice. We covered all of those questions last Thursday. I showed you what they looked like. We tried to answer each one individually. Did everybody recall that? Okay. So those are the exact questions that are possible to be on the final exam. Remember, they have hundreds of those questions, and they just happen to select 60 at random, but in 4 major categories. So in order to get your license, you have to have a proper identification. You have to have photo. You have to have a signature, a date of birth, and a permanent mailing address. You can't use a box mailing address. People need to have a permanent, fixed mailing address. And then, like us, when we go flying, we have to have not only our license on our person, we also have to have a means of identifying who we are and a photograph. And that came about not because of the FAA, because for nearly 100 years, the FAA hasn't really cared much about whether or not you had a photo ID. It's the Transportation Security Agency, brought about as a result of the 9/11, that has caused us to have so many more restrictions than we ever had before. And we have no choice. The terrorists have changed our lives in significant ways. Like anything else, you don't want to be cheating on the test. It would be really not very smart to spend a whole semester leading up to the test feeling very confident that you can pass the test because you've taken practice tests 4 or 5 times and you've gotten 85% on every one of them, to go into the final exam and cheat on it. That would be about the height of insanity to do that. So if they tell you there are certain things you cannot bring with you into the test, don't bring them. You're better off just, for example, you're better off just leaving your cell phone at home or leaving it somewhere where it's not going to be a temptation. So any other unauthorized conduct, that could be almost anything. It could be yelling and screaming during the test. It could be throwing things around. It could be wadding up paper and firing it at the guy next to you. Those are the kind of conducts that are not going to be acceptable. Retesting after failure. You can get retested after failure, and as I remember, it's about 14 days you have to wait. And you can go right away back again, and you can take the test exactly 14 days later. And you can do that a number of times. I don't know that there's ever been a restriction on the number of times you can take the test and fail it trying to pass it. I remember in my Piper agency at Burbank, we had a gentleman who was really having a tough time. I think he took the test 3 times. He finally passed it on the 3rd time, but he was having difficulty. But that's okay, Once you get your pilot license, nobody's going to ask you, well, how many times did you take the final test? They don't do that. They simply want to know, do you have a pilot license or not? The initial and recurrent knowledge tests are the same things we're going to go over. You will have far more exposure to the test that you're going to take at the end of the semester than you ever thought possible, because with the exception of today's fill-in remote pilot exam, that I'm going to cover shortly here. All the other tests will be the exact same ones that I showed you last Thursday, and that is they will be multiple choice, 3 possibilities, and they'll be worded exactly the way they were worded when I showed them to you. You happen to be in an initial training course. There are recurrent training courses. If for some reason or another you get your pilot license and you decide that you don't have the time or the energy to go out and hire out as a pilot in command, and you don't necessarily own a drone, and maybe you're not going to own a drone for a while, you may find yourself losing a little bit of the edge of knowing how to pass one of those tests. So there are ways you can get online, and you can take recurrency tests online, and using that you can prepare yourself for that every 2-year examination. But I can tell you right now, if you do any kind of drone flying at all, between the time you get your initial pilot license until the time that you have to do a recurrent exam, which is 2 years later, you won't have any trouble. And here's another thing that was not brought on by the TSA. This was just the FAA in Oklahoma City. They want to know if you move somewhere, so that if there's a reason for them to announce to you in some fashion, they want to send you a notice that maybe they're going to send to 100,000 other pilots. They want to make sure that that notice gets to wherever you live. So you've got to change the address on your pilot license if you have moved and have not notified anybody. And if there's any question at all, remember, most of that is headquartered in Oklahoma City. The FAA, Oklahoma City. All you have to do is call their main office, tell the person on the phone what you want, and they will direct you to the proper department, because it's a big organization in Oklahoma City. Voluntary surrender of a certificate. Do you have to? Do you have to voluntarily surrender your certificate? No. No, you don't. You can, if somebody comes up to you and says, "Oh, by the way, let me see your pilot license," and they take it with the intent of keeping it, is that legal? No, it's not. The only person that can make you give that up is either you or the judge. Now, the FAA may say to you, "Now look, you did this wrong, you did that wrong, you did this wrong. We're going to suspend your license for 30 days, or we're going to suspend it for a year. Turn over your license." Then you have to. Or you don't have to at that moment in time. You could say, "No, I'm not going to give it to you. I'm going to request an administrative law judge and a hearing before a judge." So you have that option. So as I say, either you can give it up because maybe you've negotiated a settlement with the FAA on your disciplinary action, or if you think you're still in the right, you can demand a hearing in front of an administrative law judge, and if you lose there, then the law judge will make you give up your license. In that case, you have to, and have any choice. So you have 2 options, either you or a law judge. Waivers. The waiver policy and the requirement. The waiver policy is nearly everything. It's amazing how much they're going to allow in the way of waivers. Part of the problem, though, is some waivers take several months to get. Other waivers you can get nearly real time. That is, if you call a certain organization and you say, "I want to photograph this giant cargo plane that's going to land at FAT. I want to photograph it tomorrow morning. I want to drone video it tomorrow morning." There are 10 organizations, or 11 by now, who can give you that information right then and there. They are authorized by the FAA to give you an immediate real-time approval of drone operations. But of course you have to describe to them where you're going to be, what time, how high you're going to fly, that sort of thing. Now, there are a list of regulations that are subject to waiver, but I can tell you it's almost every regulation. It's kind of funny because they make a big deal about all these regulations, and then they say, "Oh, by the way, if you want to get around them, you just file for a waiver." Now, there's a reason for that. It's not as dumb of the FAA as it sounds. You know, they want control over things that they allow to happen or that they prevent from happening. And if you were an FAA representative, you would probably vote exactly the same way. You would give a list of all the regulations you have to follow, and then you would say, okay, and if you want to go around any one of them, here's the procedure for doing that. Okay, that's the end of that section, and now we're going to have a little quiz based on today plus what we did last week. So all your notes, I'm sure, are out and ready. So, Chris, best you go back to your own seat, please. Remember, no books, but all the notes that you want to access, all your notes. What's amazing to me is that some of you take such beautiful, detailed notes that I can't understand why you don't get 100% on every single quiz that we ever had. Amazing. Did you throw that away?